What's up, guys? Hope you're having a good day. I want to start off by saying a big thank you to Tabitha Ritchie, who obviously came through for us in a big way last weekend. We bet on her to beat Polyana Viana, and not only did she beat Polyana Viana and come through for us big time, giving us a very nice win in that even money odds range, but the fight also played out exactly how we thought it would, where Tabitha Ritchie's wrestling would be the difference. Tabitha Ritchie put in a brilliant performance, stuck to her game plan, stuck to her strategy, showed some really good fight IQ, and I'm absolutely delighted that not only she came through for us, but she also picked up a big win in the UFC. So go head on over to Tabitha Ritchie's Instagram, man. Give her a follow, show her some love. She probably doesn't get paid that much at the moment. It's only her third fight in the UFC, so I would imagine she is on that bullshit entry-level contract where fighters get paid $10,000 to show, $10,000 to win. So show Ritchie some love, man. She came through for us in a big way. Hopefully we can bank another profit this weekend, although this card is a tough one for betting. I do have a bet that I'll be sharing with you guys in this video. I also have a couple of bets on the prelims, but this is a tough card. The bets that I'm going to be taking this week are high-risk gambles. Don't expect them to win. I don't feel that confident in my bets this week, but they're good value bets. Obviously, over the long term, if you consistently get your money into strong positions, over the long term you will make money, and that's kind of the theory that I'm using for my bets this weekend, which are very high risk but calculated gambles. But it's okay that they're high risk because we're still getting a good risk to reward ratio. So we're talking about one of those bets in this video as we break down each of the fights on the main card. But don't forget, if you want to get my analysis and my bets for the prelim fights on this card, head on over to my website, MMABettingTips.com, where I put breakdown videos out for every single fight on every single UFC card. I can't break down entire cards on YouTube because the amount of depth I go into would mean these videos would be 3 to 4 hours long. I just can't fucking talk for that long. I'd be out of breath, and none of you guys want to watch a 3 to 4 hour long video anyway. If you go onto my website, all the fights are broken down into like 10 to 20 minute individual breakdown videos for each fight. So head on over to my website if you'd like my analysis and bets on the prelim matchups. As well as that, you can find a VIP chat room where you can communicate with me on a daily basis, as well as other members in the community, talk about betting strategies, upcoming fights, betting on other sports, which to be honest is mainly what the VIP chat room is for. And yeah, you can also find a wide range of bets from me on the site, all kinds of different bets, prop bets, over-unders, straight money line bets. Pretty much all of them are profitable over the long term, obviously, not on a week-to-week basis. That would be lunacy. But anyway, yeah, check it out, MMABettingTips.com. But before we get into breaking down these fights, I also just want to make it really, really clear that gambling is extremely difficult to make money on. It took me a long time to learn from mistakes and tweak my betting strategies to eventually get to the point where I was profitable, but it's a hard road to walk. It is brutal, very difficult thing to do. A lot of people online talk about being profitable and stuff. Everyone on Twitter seems to be a profitable gambler. We know this isn't true, man. It's extremely difficult to make money gambling. So remember to gamble responsibly. Be really, really put a lot of thought into the bet you're placing. Do a lot of your own research. And yeah, man, just understand it's very important to gamble responsibly. Only gamble while you can afford to lose. And with that being said, this is not financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not telling you what to do. This video is for entertainment purposes only, and I would strongly recommend you do your own research before placing any bets, because we all lose bets all the time, man. Even this weekend, I've got 3 bets for this weekend. They're all very high risk. I don't think any of them have got a really good chance of winning, if I'm honest. Wouldn't surprise me if I went 0-3 this weekend. That is just the nature of gambling. If you want to go swimming, you got to go wet. Losing is a part of the game. With that being said, I do make a living from betting on MMA, have done for a very long time, and the information that I'm going to be sharing with you in this video is basically possible because of years and years and years and years of experience that I've got betting on MMA. I've been doing this for 15 years now, and that's why we go into so much depth on these fights. Because making money betting on sports, making money from gambling, is one of the most difficult things to do in the world, man. The odds are so stacked against us, so in order to bank those profits, you need to put in an extraordinary amount of work and go into a lot of depth and really do some complex analysis. That's what we're going to do in this video, so I hope you find the information in this video useful. What I would also love you guys to do is hit the like button for me and also subscribe. Last week, tons of you hit the like button on that Holm, the Holm breakdown video that we did last week, and I can't believe how many extra views that got. Like every YouTube video you watch at the beginning, they say hit the like button and subscribe and all this kind of stuff for the YouTube algorithm. I'm like, yeah, cool, I'll say that as well. But last week was the first time I really noticed it made a difference. After the video got so many likes, YouTube just pumped it to so many more people, and so the video got way more views than it usually would. So if you could do that again for me, I would really appreciate it. Leave a comment and like, that would be great. And in return, if this video gets 150 likes, what I'm going to do is live stream my research for the 3 big fights that we've got coming up next weekend. So I will live stream my research for Jiri Prohaska, Glover Teixeira. I will live stream my research for Joanna Jędrzejczyk against Weili Zhang, and also Valentina Shevchenko against Taylor Santos, which I actually think is a way more interesting fight than the odds suggest. I think Taylor Santos can cause Shevchenko some trouble, because Shevchenko's kind of in her early 30s now, around the stage in her career where you'd expect her to start to decline, and Santos is looking significantly better from fight to fight. So I think that fight could be a lot more interesting than the odds makers are giving her credit for. So if this video gets 150 likes, I will do those research sessions on YouTube next week. Probably do one a day, starting maybe Thursday, do Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Thursday, Friday, Monday, and we'll get those research sessions out, and we can work on researching those fights together. You get to see my research process, see how the sausage is made, and we can work as a community, as a group, to study the footage together on YouTube, and come to a consensus opinion on which fighter in each of those matchups gives us the better risk to reward ratio for our money. So you're not just watching a breakdown video of me coming to you later on YouTube summarizing what I saw in research. We can all do it together. Of course, I'll drop the breakdown video as well, but if we all research the fight together, wisdom of crowds, working as a team, as a big group of people, it's kind of hard for a big group, very knowledgeable people within this community, to not come to the correct decision and absolutely agree on which fighter gives you the better risk to reward ratio. So please hit that like button for me. 150 likes will get that done. But enough of the talking. It is time for us to break down the first fight that I want to talk about in this video, which is going to be Felice Herrig against Karolina Kowalkiewicz. Strange matchup, right? Certainly didn't expect this fight to pop up in 2022 on the main card of a UFC Fight Night event, but here we are. UFC are rolling back the years and giving us a rematch of a fight that took place 4 years ago, in which Karolina Kowalkiewicz won by split decision. Since then, Karolina has been on quite a steep decline, and while we don't know a whole lot about how Herrig has looked since then, because she's only had a couple fights since then, it's fair to assume that at this stage in Herrig's career, she probably will have declined a lot also. So in the case of Karolina, because she's been pretty active since her fight against Herrig, we've seen that decline in Karolina. Herrig, we haven't seen it because she hasn't been that active, but we can make some assumptions that due to her age, being 38 years old in a few months, we know she's absolutely ancient for a strawweight. Very, very old for a strawweight, and we know the Father Time is undefeated, and Father Time is probably going to have hit Herrig pretty hard. If we look at her record, she's only had one fight in the last sort of 3.5, 4 years against Virna Jandiroba, and that fight only lasted 1 minute and 44 seconds. So that fight doesn't really tell us anything about where Herrig is at this stage in her career, and we know that once you get past the age of sort of 32, 33, 34 years old in the strawweight division, you'll start to decline significantly, which is why there are barely any fighters in the strawweight division still competing into their late 30s. Herrig and Karolina are 2 of the few still kicking it at that age. And so we know the likelihood is Herrig this weekend is probably going to look significantly worse than she did back in 2018 against Michelle Waterson. If we're being brutally honest, she didn't look particularly good back in 2018. So what's interesting about this fight is we know that Karolina's on a steep decline, but while we haven't seen Herrig in a long time, it's fair to us assume she's also on a steep decline because of her age, right? Father Time's undefeated. She's very old for a strawweight. And we know that the younger weight classes, or no, the younger weight classes, the lighter weight classes, like the strawweight division, they're all about speed, reflexes, and athleticism, which tend to be some of the first things to go as you start to get older. So Herrig facing a lot of challenges this weekend. And if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one. Whoops, should have had this up. My bad. If we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Herrig is the slight favourite at average odds of about 1.80, which is going to be minus 125 for an implied probability of 56%. If we take a look at the odds on Carolina, she's the slight underdog at average odds of about 2.05. So what's very interesting about this matchup, sorry, that's an implied probability of 49%. So bookies feel this fight's roughly in that 50-50 odds range. It could go either way. But what I find really interesting about these odds is that Herrig is the slight favourite. And I think there is a bit of a mistake in the odds here. Now, that doesn't mean betting on Karolina Kowalkiewicz is a smart thing to do, or there's tons of value on Carolina. But if I was setting the odds on this fight, I would probably have the odds the other way round, or Carolina is a slightly bigger favourite, maybe in that 1.70, I think minus 140 range, simply because I feel these odds are set based on how bad Carolina has looked over the last few years. But I feel they're kind of overlooking the fact that Herrig hasn't really fought since 2018. So I feel these odds are set in a way where they're judging Carolina based on her recent performances and how bad she's looked, and they're basing the odds on how Herrig looked back in 2018. But the odds aren't really taking into consideration the fact that Herrig is likely to have also declined in the last 4 years quite a lot, and quite possibly at a faster rate than Carolina. So I think that the odds are perhaps the wrong way round here, because I don't think they're taking into consideration the fact that Herrig's probably also declined a lot as well. It's just hard for us to predict how much, because she's been so inactive. So in terms of X factors on this matchup, there are a lot to talk about. We've already spoken about the age of Herrig. The age of Carolina is also an issue. She's 36 years old. Again, no spring chicken. Very, very old for a strawweight. And she's also going to be declining from fight to fight. But as we've said, we've seen the decline in Carolina. Haven't seen the decline in Herrig yet. Herrig is 5'4" with a 65-inch reach. Carolina's 5'3" with a 64-inch reach, which does show a bit of a size and reach advantage for Herrig. However, we've also seen them fight back in 2018, and there wasn't really any noticeable size difference between the two. Herrig's a little bit more muscular, but it didn't seem like she had any kind of physicality advantage in that matchup. Both girls look roughly about the same size, so I wouldn't really put too much weight on any little size difference that Herrig might have. But there are other issues with Carolina. We've spoken about her steep decline, and one of the major reasons why she is on a steep decline is because, unfortunately, in 2019, she was diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease. I want to say a big thank you to Consigliere, who is a long-term member of my community, for bringing this to my attention earlier this week. And I have a lot of experience with autoimmune diseases. My wife has got one. I've spent a long time researching autoimmune diseases because the medications that they prescribe for autoimmune diseases are, generally pretty good at reducing symptoms that come from the autoimmune disease. But because the, medications prescribed are so strong, they also create other problems elsewhere and other problems, further on down the road with longer term health issues and, side effects that come from taking really, strong medications. So when someone is diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it's a really difficult position to be in, because the disease is going to cause you a lot of problems, but the medications are also probably going to cause you a lot of problems. And there's that trade-off with, do you try and manage the disease in other ways through diet and lifestyle choices, or do you go all in on the medication? And probably the best combination for most people, I guess, is a nice balance between the two, right? Really healthy lifestyle with some medication that hopefully mitigates some of those circumstances. But for a professional athlete to be diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it's absolutely devastating, because autoimmune diseases are very unpredictable and the symptoms are very variable, and you never know when they're going to flare up. Autoimmune diseases are like really, really, really complex allergens or allergies with lots of different triggers. So if you think about like an allergy, right? If you have hay fever and you get exposed to pollen, symptoms are going to present themselves. If you have a peanut allergy and you eat peanuts, symptoms are going to present themselves. Autoimmune diseases are very much like that, except there are lots of different triggers. And it could be things like, different foods, environmental factors. It could be, stress levels. And a massive trigger for all autoimmune diseases is stress. So for a professional athlete to be diagnosed with an autoimmune disease like Hashimoto's, it's absolutely devastating, because it's very difficult to control your stress levels when you're going to be fighting in a cage, in your underwear, in front of millions of people, right? I can't think of many things that are more stressful than being an MMA fighter. The stress of making weight, the performance anxiety, the pressure of winning, the nerves, the jitters the night before. And so even if on a day-to-day basis, Karolina, has spoken to her physicians and her doctors, and they've told her that stress has a big impact on how severe your symptoms will be on a day-to-day basis. And for the most part, through meditation and just living a chilled life, she's got a really good control of her stress levels in her life. The problem is, if she then experiences a lot of stress during fight week, doing loads of interviews and media and, cutting weight, out of nowhere, even if her Hashimoto's disease is relatively under control the majority of the time, during fight week it could really flare up and catch her by surprise. So the problem when you're betting with, thinking of betting on a fighter with an autoimmune disease, is that you can't really quantify what impact it's going to have on them, because you could watch them perform, in one fight and it might not affect them that much, because it didn't flare up during that fight week, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't flare up during their next fight week. So whenever you see a fighter that's diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, it makes it very difficult to bet on them, because it adds a huge element of uncertainty to how they're going to perform. They're just not going to be consistent anymore, because they don't know when those symptoms are going to rear their ugly head. And you've only got to look at some of the symptoms of Hashimoto's to see that Karolina is really battling with something very nasty here. Fatigue and sluggishness, sensitivity to cold, increased sleepiness, dry skin, muscle weakness, muscle aches, pains, tenderness, stiffness, joint pain, depression. It's an absolute nightmare, right, for a fighter to deal with the stress of all this, all these symptoms, as well as, doing one of the most difficult, most strenuous things on the body imaginable, which is being an MMA fighter. And what also makes me a little bit sad about Karolina's case in particular is that she has adopted a vegan diet as a way to try and better control the symptoms of Hashimoto's disease. Now, remember a few moments ago I said that lifestyle choices and diet are, can have a profound effect on most people's symptoms with an autoimmune disease. But the problem with the vegan diet is that there are a lot of foods that are very prominent in the vegan diet which tend to kind of trigger autoimmune symptoms pretty bad, which isn't ideal. I don't want to get into huge debates over diets, but the problem with a vegan diet is that it tends to be very high in foods that have high concentrations of lectins. So things like nuts, things like beans, things like peas, right? These are the foods that vegans eat to get their protein. And generally speaking, you can do some research on this if you want to go into more depth, but generally speaking, foods that are very high in lectins tend to be terrible for people with autoimmune diseases, because the symptoms that present themselves in autoimmune diseases are a result of the immune system just going crazy, being, overactive, right? It's that chronic inflammation that comes from the immune system always being on high alert. And lectins, foods that contain, high concentrations of lectins tend to irritate the gut and overly stimulate the immune system, which as a result obviously causes the immune system to go crazy and people with autoimmune diseases and symptoms to flare up even more. When you have an autoimmune disease, you want to be eating a diet which is anti-inflammatory and a diet that does not stress out the immune system. A vegan diet, eating a lot of lectins is going to have the opposite effect. And so, it's very disappointing that Karolina has chosen to go with a vegan diet to try and control her symptoms. I've done a lot of research on this topic and I feel bad for her. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and Karolina's probably done her own research and thought that a vegan diet's really healthy. Hopefully it will work for me, but it very likely is making her symptoms worse and making her Hashimoto's even more difficult to control. Like I said, I've done a lot of research on the topic, and I wish she wasn't on that diet, because lectin high foods are quite nasty for people with autoimmune diseases and any immune issues for that matter. So that's one big X factor when it comes to Karolina. We were saying the odds are the wrong way round and Karolina should be the slight favourite, and I still stand by that. But it's very dangerous to bet on a fighter like Karolina, because now that we know she's got that autoimmune disease, we never know how she's going to perform from one fight to another. And Hashimoto's disease is probably a primary reason why she has declined so much over the last few years. But there's also some positive stuff to talk about in terms of X factors with Karolina, because she's made the huge step in the lead up to this camp to move from Poland to Boca Raton, Florida, to train at American Top Team, which is one of the best MMA gyms in the world, which is a great move for Karolina. And you can see that she is getting in work with some top class training partners. There's Junior Dos Santos and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I mean, there's not going to be many female training partners in the strawweight division that you could pick than Joanna Jędrzejczyk. So I think this is a brilliant move for Karolina Kowalkiewicz, and I think only good can come from this. And I think despite her, pretty significant decline over the last few years, I think what this shows is that even if her body isn't holding up as well as it used to, even if she can't do the things athletically that she used to do, she still has that fire in her belly, that passion to fight, that desire to win. Because at this stage in her career, going to be 37 years old this year, to leave Poland and move to do a training camp in Florida, it's a big commitment. Not only is it a big financial commitment, but it is, it's a big stress, right, to move from one country to another for a few months to work and to train. So I think the fact that she's doing this camp in Florida is a sign that she's dead serious about this fight and is coming in fully motivated. When we see fighters start to decline in that tail end of their career, in their late 30s, I always think that while a big part of it is Father Time just catching up with them, I think another part of it is that they're just not as young and hungry and motivated as they were earlier in their career, right? Because they've probably come to the realization that they're not going to achieve their goals, right? Karolina's a smart lady. She's going to understand that she's probably never going to be a UFC champion. That's got to take something from you. It's got to affect your motivation and how hard you push and train and look to improve on a day-to-day basis. You probably start to go through the motions a little bit, where fighting becomes more of a job. You don't have that same hunger to improve and grow. And so, when I see a fighter like Karolina invest in herself and make a big move like this, it definitely shows me that, at the very least, she's all in when it comes to this fight, even if her body's not capable of doing things that it used to do. So with this matchup in particular, we've spent a long time talking about the X factors in this matchup, and I think that's important because I think it's probably going to be the X factors that determine the outcome of this matchup. I mean, we could talk a lot about how these two girls match up from a stylistic point of view, but ultimately I think it's going to be which one of these fighters has the most to give at this late stage in their career that's going to come out on top. Because you look at Herrig's record, 0-3 in her last 3 fights. You look at Karolina's record, 0-5 in her last 5. It doesn't look good on paper. And while the MMA records don't always tell the whole story, the performances from both these girls have kind of been reflected in the outcomes of their fights, right? They haven't looked very good, and so it's no surprise that they've lost a lot of fights recently. So we can quickly run through how they match up from a stylistic point of view, although like I say, I don't think, very rarely you'll hear me say this, I don't think it's actually that important who has an advantage in this fight in each individual area, be it striking or grappling. I really do think it's going to come down to who has more to give at this late stage in their careers. So when it comes to all areas of this fight, it's pretty close, right? Even though on paper you'd give Carolina the striking advantage and you'd give Herrig the grappling advantage, when you look at their striking and grappling at this stage in their career, there's really not a big skill gap between the two. If you go back and watch their fight from 2018, Herrig held her own just fine in kickboxing range, and the striking was really, really close and competitive. Similarly, on the ground, you'd probably give Herrig a slight advantage because she's a bit heavier from top position, a bit of a better offensive wrestler, but both girls are pretty low level on the ground. They're both very weak off their back. I know we see more grappling from Herrig in her fights, but she started life as a Muay Thai fighter, so she's also kind of got a base in striking, who evolved more into a well-rounded mixed martial artist when she, progressed through her career. But on the ground, with both girls being so weak off their back, you wouldn't give either of them a huge advantage on the ground. The only area where I see a big advantage for either girl is in the clinch. If you go back and watch their first fight from back in 2018, Kowalkiewicz did amazing work in the clinch, landed a lot of damage, landed some big significant shots in the clinch, and that's an area where I think she can have a lot of success against Herrig. So in terms of our approach to betting this fight, if you do want to bet this fight, I think Carolina is the stronger side to be on. I think Carolina gives you the better risk to reward ratio. She's looked awful in the last few years. Trust me, I'm not trying to sugarcoat things, but she is the slight underdog, and we haven't seen Herrig for 4 years. So sometimes better the devil you know, right? With Carolina, we know exactly what we're getting from her. We know Herrig didn't look good back in 2018. She's probably going to look a lot worse in 2022. And at the very least, Carolina's been active. We've seen her fight. Herrig could be coming back for one last, roll of the dice, one last retirement fight, which, never really ends well. Maybe one last paycheck. Who knows? But I do think Carolina's the better side to be on. This is probably a dog or pass situation, but I would urge you not to bet this fight because I think the odds are roughly where they should be. They should be in that 50-50 odds range, and I think this fight could go either way. So let's now move on to the next fight, which is going to be Alonzo Menifield against Askar Mozharov, making his UFC debut. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Alonzo Menifield is the favourite at average odds of about 1.63, which is minus 159 for an implied probability of 61%. If we take a look at the odds on Mozharov, he is around an average of 2.40, which is plus 140 for an implied probability of 42%. So the odds are giving us that 60-40 implied probability odds range in favour of Menifield. And we can see, if we look at the odds movement chart, we can see that the odds have been steadily declining on Menifield since the odds were first released for this fight. And I get it, man. This is a good stylistic matchup for Menifield. So Menifield is 34 years old, 6 foot tall with a 76-inch reach. Mozharov, 27 years old, 6'3". We don't know what his reach is. So might have a bit of a size and reach advantage over Menifield, but we know that Menifield's an athletic freak. He's in great shape. He's got a good gas tank as well for someone with his body type. You're a big, muscular, athletic dude like Menifield. You'd usually expect him to slow down a lot as fights wear on. Menifield slows a bit as fights wear on, but nothing crazy, nothing major. And so I don't expect size to be too much of a factor in this one. Now, this fight is a bit of a difficult one to get a really confident read on, because despite the fact that Mozharov has had over 30 pro fights, there's not that much footage available on him. A lot of his fights are available to watch online, but the ones that are available to watch online don't last very long. They end very quickly. And so there are a lot of question marks over Mozharov in terms of things like, what is his gas tank like, right? What is he going to perform like in the second and third round? how is he going to perform if he gets hurt on the feet or his opponents start to offer up a little bit of resistance on the feet. Because the vast majority of Mozarov's fights end with him just completely murdering his opponent in round one, landing the kill shot, knocking him out. And for that reason, even though he looks very impressive, he's doing that against a very low level of opponent, which means we don't really know how this guy is going to look when he faces that big jump up in competition against a guy like Alonzo Menifield. If you take a look at Mozarov's record, remember he's had 32 pro fights, and you can see that the vast majority of these fights have ended in less than 3 minutes. You know, round one, all these fights. Look at all these fights that ended in round one. Absolutely tons of fights have ended in round one. So, you know, the problem with this is he's one of these guys, and I'll show you a little bit of footage on Mozharov in a second to show you this, but he is one of these guys that's very aggressive. He has that kill or be killed style where he comes out the gate trying to murder everyone in round one. And as we know, guys like Mozharov that usually come out the gate very hard and then fade when they don't get the job done like they usually do, they usually look very bad in rounds 2 and 3. They're very, very prone to adrenaline dumping because they're used to smoking guys in 30, 40 seconds. They're not used to pacing themselves over a 15-minute war of attrition the last 3 rounds. Now, I'm not saying Mozharov is that dude. Perhaps Mozharov is going to be a cardio machine and look absolutely phenomenal. He could be. But all we can do is make a judgment call on Mozharov based on most likely outcomes. And if you think about all these guys that come out with that kill or be killed style, like a Terence McKinney, remember what Uros Medic looked like against Jalen Turner before making that big improvement last weekend against Omar Morales. But these guys that are used to just coming out, smoking dudes in round one, usually fade very, very hard if they don't get the job done early. So if Alonzo Menifield can weather the early storm, I think Menifield's chances of winning this fight go up exponentially, because I would imagine Mozharov will adrenaline dump and look quite flat in rounds 2 and 3. And if you look at some of his fights here, you'll kind of see what I mean. Now, obviously the YouTube copyright algorithm's pretty aggressive, so I might have to black out some of these videos if this video gets flagged for copyright. I won't know if it does or not until I upload it. So if you want to watch like the full unedited breakdown videos, go to my website mmabettingtips.com, where I won't have to black the footage out. Obviously we're using this as fair use, should be allowed under copyright law, but we know the YouTube copyright algorithm is very aggressive. But anyway, I want to show you what most of Mozharov's fights look like. So Mozharov is the gentleman with the red gloves, and as you can see, he's very big, very muscular, very powerful, very athletic, very explosive. He's got devastating knockout power in his hands, and as you can see very early on here, aggressive, right, looking to take his opponent out here. There's no range finding shots, there's no jabs, you know, he's not trying to set his power strikes up. He's looking to come forward and take you out. That fight literally lasted a matter of seconds. It's over. Here's another one. You know, very, very early on, this is the start of the first round, and again, just comes out very aggressive, looking to take his opponent's head off. And you know, it's only a matter of time before he lands a bomb. There you go, left hook, puts his opponent down, aggressive ground and pound to follow up, and again the fight is over in seconds. And look at the neck muscles on Mozharov. Look how big he is, look how muscular his arms are. And again, this fight was against Konstantin Linik, which took place back in July 2020. And the 3 fights that I've shown you here are his last 3 fights as well. You can see this one lasted 33 seconds, this one 27 seconds. This one says it lasted 2 minutes 34, but as you'll see now, it doesn't. This one is literally over in seconds as well. And exactly like his other fights, comes out the gate super aggressive, just looking to take his opponent out. Now, as you can see, he's got pretty nice Muay Thai, very nice head kicks, you know, pretty nasty leg kicks. His striking reminds me a little bit of Thiago Santos in the way he moves. He throws a lot more spinning attacks and leg kicks than Thiago Santos, but similar kind of stance, similar type of body, similar body type, similar kind of striking. As you can see there, that fight definitely didn't last 2.5 minutes. That one was over in just a few seconds as well. So This is the problem with trying to make a really accurate prediction on how this fight is likely to play out. Most of Mozharov's fights end like that, which don't really tell us a lot apart from the fact that he's big and scary and very dangerous early on. But he does fit the profile of someone that will have a bad gas tank and that will adrenaline dump and burn himself out if he doesn't get the job done early, because he's big and muscular. You know, you can see he doesn't pace himself. Everything that he throws is looking to knock his opponent out. He's throwing everything into every shot. His big explosive spinning attacks. And while he's very, very dangerous early on, I imagine that he will likely turn into a bit of a pussycat into the second and third round if you can weather that early storm. Guys like Mozharov, more often than not, will adrenaline dump if they don't get the early knockout, because they're not used to guys being able to take their shots and survive into the second and third round. But obviously, as they face a step up in competition, they face a higher level of opponent. You know, someone like Menifield, the probability increases that they're going to have to go into the second and third round, because guys in the UFC aren't just going to roll over and play dead like these guys on the low-level regional circuit in the countries that Mozharov has been fighting in. What I can tell you about Mozharov is that his takedown defense is very bad, and his ground game is also extremely bad. He's very, very weak off his back. He doesn't really appear to have any kind of grappling at all. This means that Menifield has got a clear, obvious and easy path to victory here, because Menifield is a pretty strong grappler. If Menifield were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, I think he'd take Mozharov down and absolutely dominate him. The problem with Menifield is that he doesn't have the best fight IQ, doesn't always take the easiest path to victory, and doesn't actually grapple that much. He's often very reluctant to grapple. You know, Menifield is one of these guys that, for whatever reason, prefers to keep fights standing, and as we've just seen in the video footage that I showed you of Mozharov, that might not be a good idea because of how dangerous Mozharov is. You know, Menifield's pretty tough, he's got a reasonably good chin, but we also know he can be caught. You know, OSP knocked him out. It would be a big mistake for Menifield to try and stand in front of Mozharov, because Mozharov probably does have the advantage when it comes to striking. The question is, for how long does he have that advantage? Will Mozharov burn himself out? Has he got a big gas tank with those big old muscles and that explosive knockout power? It's unlikely, but it's possible. So from a betting point of view, I definitely lean towards Menifield here. He is the rightful favourite. If you do want to bet this fight, I do think Menifield is the better side to be on. We know he's got an enormous advantage if the fight goes to the ground. His gas tank is reasonably good, and with how much Mozharov loads up on those big power shots, chances are he's not going to pace himself very well, and he's probably going to burn himself out pretty quickly. So unless he gets the job done and knocks Menifield out in like the first 2 or 3 minutes, it's probably going to be a pretty tough fight for Mozharov. Maybe Mozharov is a unicorn that has an amazing gas tank, but guys that look like him with those big old muscles and fight as aggressively as that usually are very prone to adrenaline dumping. So Menifield's the right side to be on here, but it's obviously risky because Mozharov, very dangerous striker. So we will now get into breaking down the next fight, which features another debutant in Silva as she takes on Poliana Botelho. So let's take a look at the odds on this one. So Silva is the favourite at average odds of about 1.85, which is minus 118 for an implied probability of 54%. And Poliana Botelho is the underdog at average odds of around 2.0, which is plus 100 for an implied probability of 50%. So another fight that's in that even money odds range. Both girls are very, very close to a 50-50 implied probability. And if you've consumed my content for a while, if you've been a member of my website for a while, you will know that I absolutely love betting women's MMA, and I absolutely love betting on fights in that even money odds range, because when you've got two fighters with those 50-50, roughly 50-50 implied probabilities on both fighters, if you can just lean 60-40 one way or the other, you can get yourself a great risk to reward ratio and find a strong position for you to put your money. And of course, we perform really well on bets in the even money odds range, and we also perform really well on women's MMA fights. Matern is a long-time member of my community, and Matern is responsible on my website for doing like data analysis. What Matern basically does is study trends within MMA, so we can bet more from an informational, data, statistical point of view. But Matern also does a lot of analysis on my performance. So what he'll do is analyze any long-term trends of specific kind of bets that we're not performing well on, because obviously we want to place less bets we don't perform well on. And he looks at the kind of bets we perform really well on, because obviously we want to double down and place more of those kind of bets. And our win rate on women's MMA fights is above 70%, which is obviously an amazing win rate. We perform really, really well when betting women's MMA. I mean, we won a great bet on Tabitha Ritchie last weekend. She came through for us in a big way. And so whenever I see a women's MMA fight like this in that even money odds range, it's the perfect type of betting for me, because not only is it in an odds range where you can often find good value, but at the same time we perform really, really well on women's MMA. And I think the reason why we perform so well on women's MMA is simply because you see a lot less crazy shit, a lot less flash knockouts. Ultimately, the lighter the weight class, it doesn't matter if it's the men's flyweight division, the women's atomweight division, it doesn't matter what it is. If you have lighter human beings that don't weigh as much, you get less flash knockouts because they don't carry as much weight in them to deliver that knockout kill shot. And so you don't see as many random flash KOs in women's MMA as you do in men's MMA. And I think that's why we perform really well on women's MMA, because the majority of women's MMA fights go the distance, which means when you identify that a female fighter in a contest has an advantage, if the fight goes the distance, they've got longer in that matchup to exercise that advantage than if there were some kind of flash KO. For example, you look at last weekend, we knew that Tabitha Ritchie was a great bet because over the 15 minutes, the fight was very likely to go the distance, and she'd be able to eventually use her wrestling advantage to take Viana down and kind of grind her out, which is exactly what happened. But if you are in a division like the middleweight division or light heavyweight division or the heavyweight division where you get a lot of knockouts, perhaps Viana would have knocked Ritchie out in round one, and we never would have got an opportunity to win that bet because Ritchie wouldn't have had enough time to exercise her advantages. So we perform great on bets in the even money odds range. You can see if we go to results here. Where are we? If we scroll down, where are they? There we go. We performed really well on fights in the even money odds range, and we performed really well on women's MMA fights as well. So let's dig into this one, right? Poliana Botelho, 33 years old, 5'8" with a 67 inch reach. Karine Silva, 28 years old, 5'5" with a 67 inch reach. So Poliana Botelho, bit older than Silva, 5-year age gap here, and she also looks like she might have a bit of a size advantage as well. 5'8" versus 5'5". I'm very interested to see how these two girls look at the stare downs at the weigh-ins, because sometimes you see a size difference like that and it's not really anything major. Other times you see a size difference like that and the girl that's 5'8" will absolutely tower over the girl that's 5'5". And what I have noticed when watching some of Silva's matchups is that she's often a lot smaller than her opponents. So chances are she's pretty small for the division. So it will be well worth keeping an eye on the size difference in this matchup, because we know there are weight classes for a reason, right? Size and physicality often has a big impact in how MMA matchups play out. And as a result, that could put Silva at a bit of a disadvantage here. But the stats on Tapology are, especially for UFC debutants, quite often wrong. We didn't even know what Mozharov's reach was. So it'd be worth looking at the stare downs here to see if there's any kind of notable size difference between these two. So what I'm going to do is I'm breaking this one down from a stylistic point of view. I'm going to play you a little bit of footage of Karine Silva. Unfortunately, just like with Mozharov, there's not tons of footage available on Silva, which does make it very difficult to get a strong read on this fight. But I could break it down for you and talk to you about how these two girls match up stylistically based on what I have seen. If you look at Silva's record, you can see that just like with Mozharov, so many of her fights have ended in round one. Her fights don't tend to last very long. And that's a nightmare, because when fights are over very quickly in just a minute or two, 2-3 minutes, they don't tell us a lot. They don't tell us a lot about the fighter's gas tank. They don't tell us a lot about how they're going to deal with facing resistance or when put in bad positions. They don't tell us how they're going to pace themselves over 3 rounds. We don't get a lot of information. And the problem with the footage that's available on Silva is that not only do most of her fights end very quickly, but the footage that we do have on her is predominantly grappling. There's very, very little footage available on her striking, which makes it very difficult to predict how she matches up from a stylistic point of view with Poliana Botelho when it comes to striking. I can't really call it because I haven't seen a whole lot of Karine Silva's striking. So if we go back to the beginning here, you can kind of see the size difference there, where we were talking earlier on about how Silva does look to be pretty small for the division. You can see that Sidi Rocha absolutely towers over her there. She does look very, very undersized. But anyway, she is in the blue gloves here. You can watch this as we're breaking this one down. So when it comes to striking, I'm finding it very difficult to kind of get a read on who has the advantage. As you can see here, there's nothing special about Silva's striking. Doesn't seem to have too much power in her hands. She's not particularly fast or technical. But there's nothing special about Poliana Botelho's striking either. Botelho does have a predominantly kicks-based style of striking. You know, she could generate a lot of power with her kick. She's got a pretty nasty kicking game, but her striking, defense, and her boxing is very, very limited. Botelho doesn't really have any kind of boxing. But because there's such little footage available on Silva's striking, I don't really know how these girls match up when it comes to striking. I would give Botelho like the power, the physicality advantage on the feet. She can generate a lot of pop in her kicks, but I don't know if that's going to be enough to give her the edge over Silva on the feet, because Botelho's boxing is pretty poor. Now, when it comes to grappling, we've got a lot more information to work with, because like I said, so many of Silva's fights end up on the ground. And what I could tell you about these two girls is that they're kind of similar when it comes to grappling. They have a lot of weaknesses there. Their takedown defense is generally pretty bad. You can see Silva gave up a really weak takedown there. And another issue with Silva and Botelho is that they're both very weak on their back. If you put Botelho and Silva on their back, they're both pretty easy to hold down. You could rack up a lot of top control on them, easy to score points against them. So from a betting point of view, even though we perform really, really well on women's MMA fights, really, really well on fights in that even money odds range, this matchup is a nightmare from a betting point of view, because we don't really know how these girls match up when it comes to striking, because of a lack of footage on Silva's striking. And we don't really know who's going to have the edge in the grappling, because both girls are so weak off their back. It's going to turn into a bit of a Wild West shootout, where whoever gets the takedown first, or whoever more actively looks to get their opponent to the ground, is the fighter that is going to be more likely to be in top position. And because of how weak they both are off their back, we know that whoever spends more time in top positions, more than likely going to win the fight. So it's a very, very difficult fight to call, and a very difficult one to read. From a betting point of view, I am leaning towards Karine Silva, just because, as you can see here, she is quite active off her back. Even though she doesn't make much of an effort to get back up to her feet, she's still more active off her back than Botelho is. You know, Botelho doesn't tend to do a lot off her back, and we don't know a lot about her striking. So I'm hoping she'll have an edge there, because Botelho's striking isn't particularly good. I don't have many positive things to say about Botelho. She does slow down a lot as fights wear on. Her volume drops a lot as fights wear on. But with Silva not having that much experience going the distance, remember what we said with Mozharov, you know, Silva's gas tank probably isn't great either. So because of a lack of really good quality footage on Silva, this is a dangerous fight to bet, because we don't really know what to expect from her. But based on what we have seen, if you really, really want to bet this fight for action, I would go with Silva. I think she's the better side to be on. I think she's the more well-rounded, complete mixed martial artist. But Viana could also be too big, too strong, too powerful for her. And if she gets into top position, she's likely to be able to rack up a lot of top control. So I hope you found that breakdown video useful. We will now get into breaking down the next fight in this video, which is going to be Mike Trizano against Lucas Almeida, another debutant making his way onto the main card. And don't forget to hit the like button, man. If you like these breakdown videos, please hit that like button. If this video gets 150 likes, I'll be doing those fight research live streams for the 3 big matchups next week. Jiri Prohaska versus Glover Teixeira, Weili Zhang against Joanna Jędrzejczyk, the rematch, and of course Valentina Shevchenko against Taylor Santos. Hit the like button, guys. I would really appreciate it. So let's take a look at the odds on this one. We have got Where is he? Where is he? Mike Trizano, average odds of about 1.44. One of the biggest favourites on the card, which is minus 227 for an implied probability of 69%. And if we take a look at the odds on Lucas Almeida, he is around an average of, call it, 2.95, which is going to be plus 195 for an implied probability of 34%. So whenever I see a fighter like Mike Trizano as a big favourite, it always gets my spidey senses tingling, because we know this guy has got a lot of weaknesses, right? He's really passive, really tentative at times, struggles to put his stamp on rounds, and we know that on the ground he's pretty low level. So whenever I see a guy like Trizano at big favourite odds, I'm always interested in betting his opponent as a big underdog, because there could be a good amount of value there. However, after researching this fight, I can tell you that the odds do make sense, and I do agree that Trizano should be a big favourite here. This is a pretty good stylistic matchup for him for all the reasons that I'll share with you now. So Trizano is 30 years old, 5'11" with a 71-inch reach, and Lucas Almeida is 31 years old, 5'11" with a 71-inch reach. So both guys virtually identical, about the same size and about the same age as well. What's also good about this matchup, if you're Mike Trizano, is that Lucas Almeida is a pure striker. I'm going to play some footage of one of his recent matchups here. This was against Nico Kowalkiewicz, and as you'll see when watching this fight, I believe this was Kowalkiewicz. Let me just double check. I might have the wrong fight. I might have the wrong one. Wait a minute. I've got the wrong fight. Bear with me a second. I'll find the correct one here. So if we go Kowalkiewicz, Almeida. Brought the wrong one up. Sorry guys. Here we go. Here's the one I wanted. Just so it lasts a bit longer so we get to see a bit more of Almeida. So in this video, Almeida is the guy in the white shorts. And this video will help you see why this is a pretty good stylistic matchup for Trizano. So we'll hit play. So, as we've said, Mike Trizano's biggest weakness is his takedown offense and ground game. He's very, very weak off his back and doesn't really have any kind of ground game. Having said that, because Mike Trizano has trained at Tiger Schulman for his entire career, he is kind of difficult to take down and difficult to hold down. We know that these Tiger Schulman guys, like, you know, Julio Arce or Jimmy Rivera or a Lyman Good or Uriah Hall, you know, these Tiger Schulman guys are very difficult to take down and hold down. They're pure strikers, but their takedown defense for the most part is pretty good. You look at a guy like Shane Burgos, right? Difficult to take down and hold down. Trizano's no different. If you get Trizano down, his ground game's loyal, but it's not easy getting him to the ground and keeping him on the ground. And when you look at Almeida's style of fighting, you can see that he's just a brawler. He's a pure striker. He's very aggressive. He likes to come forward, take control of the center of the octagon, and look to take your head off, right? He's a big power puncher. He's not a grappler. Don't get me wrong. If you go back and watch this fight, you'll see that there is a decent amount of grappling in this matchup, but it's mainly because his opponent goes down very easily like that. And Almeida just kind of jumps into top position, chips away with ground and pound. But it's not like Almeida is committing really hard to the takedown in this fight, using wrestling, you know, using chain wrestling to get his opponent down and keep him down. He's just, you know, very aggressive and looking to come forward and put it on his opponent. And sometimes in this matchup, that means that, you know, this Kowalkiewicz guy gets overwhelmed and it ends up on the ground on his back. And Almeida jumps into top position, hammers him with ground and pound. But I don't think Almeida's got the offensive wrestling to take a guy like Trizano down. I don't think he's got the grappling control to hold Trizano down either. I think if Trizano wants to keep this fight standing, which he likely will, it's going to be a stand-up fight. And in a stand-up fight, I give Trizano a pretty big advantage. The reason being, Almeida's one of these guys that comes out the gate very hard. You can see it here, right? He's marching forward, taking control of the center of the octagon, and just looking to overwhelm his opponent with pressure and volume with those big power strikes. But he's quite reckless, and the longer the fight goes, the more tired he gets, the worse he becomes defensively, and his volume really drops off a cliff. I'm not saying that Almeida's got a bad gas tank, but because he fights at such a high pace, naturally he's going to get tired, and as a result, as the fight wears on into the second and third round, he just becomes flatter, sloppier, and doesn't throw as much. In this first round, you can see him crazy aggressive, throwing a really high volume of strikes. But if we skip through into the third round, you can see that his volume definitely dips a bit, where he's not as aggressive. And that's where I feel Trizano can have a lot of success in this fight, because the one thing that makes Trizano great is that he's very, very good defensively. He's got good footwork, good head movement, rolls with the punches. He's very technical, does a good job of staying behind the jab. And even though Trizano may get outstruck early and maybe a little bit overwhelmed with the pressure and the aggression of Almeida early, I think as this fight goes into the second and third round and Almeida starts to become a little bit sloppy, a little bit reckless, his volume starts to drop, I think that's when Trizano can start to get his boxing going, start to get his jab going, and just win the fight by being the more technical striker. So the other issue we've got with Trizano is that he tends to be quite tentative, quite passive, and at times struggles to put his stamp on rounds. That's one of the reasons why I think this is a really good stylistic matchup for him, because Trizano's big weakness on the feet is not his technique. He's a very good striker. His problem is that he just doesn't let his hands go enough. But when a guy like Trizano faces a guy like Almeida, it can often bring out the best in guys like Trizano because they're forced to engage. You know, Almeida's not going to stand in the middle of the octagon and get into a staring contest with Trizano where we're left with these really close rounds where not a lot happens. Almeida will come forward, force Trizano to engage, and then naturally Trizano should be getting the better of those exchanges by being the more technical striker. So I really feel this is one of those matchups where Almeida's aggression and volume is likely to work against him simply because Trizano is the better striker. So this is a good stylistic matchup for Trizano. You can see here deep in this third round, Almeida is kind of sloppy, overly aggressive, quite bad defensively. And I think Trizano's technical enough to make him pay. Now, from really any opportunities here for us to put our money in a strong position because Trizano is a very big favourite, right? If you look at the odds on Trizano, odds are about 1.44 minus 227. That's an implied probability of 69%. In order to find any value on Trizano, you've got to give him a better than 69% chance of winning, which is a very, very difficult thing to do when you take into consideration the fact that he has big weaknesses, right? We know he isn't great on the ground, so if Almeida did flip the script on us and come in with a grappling heavy game plan, if his grappling did look a lot better than it did in the past, we know he can cause Trizano big trouble on the ground. Even though it's unlikely, we know it's possible. And also, we know Trizano is one of these guys that doesn't show the most urgency, does tend to hold back from time to time, does struggle to put his stamp on rounds. And if he doesn't go out there and let his hands go and put his stamp on rounds, Almeida's aggressive enough to make this a really close fight that could go either way. So, in terms of betting Trizano, the risk factors are just too big to be able to find any value on him, at these odds. On the flip side, I don't feel like betting on Almeida either, because even though he's a big underdog, ultimately he is a striker and he's facing a much better striker here in Mike Trizano. So we know it's a very difficult stylistic matchup for him. If both guys show up and perform to their full potential, Trizano should be able to outstrike him, beat him pretty comfortably, and because of that, I just don't want to put my money in that much danger, even though Almeida is a big underdog. So when we look at this fight from a betting point of view, and we consider which guy gives us the better risk to reward ratio, it's difficult to say. I think the odds are probably where they should be. I'd probably say go with Trizano because he wins a really high percentage of the time, in my opinion. But with him being such a big favourite, he's not giving you a good risk to reward ratio for your money. And this is probably a fight that you should avoid for betting. So I hope you found that useful. Now let's break down the co-main event between Dan Ige and Movsar Evloev. So this is a really complex fight and a very interesting fight from a betting point of view. So I'm looking forward to digging into this one for you. Please also remember to hit the like button below if you like this video, if you like this content. It would help me out a lot. I would really appreciate it. If this video gets 150 likes, we're going to be live streaming UFC 275 related content all next week. So please hit that like button for me below. I would really, really appreciate it. Now, this fight between Dan Ige and Movsar Evloev is a really good opportunity for us to talk about some sports betting concepts and strategies. Now, if you are an experienced gambler, the stuff that I'm going to be talking about will probably be common sense to you. So I apologize if this is going to be a bit boring and you don't want to hear it. But I'm very, very conscious that everyone starts somewhere, right? There was a point in time where I didn't know anything about sports betting. I was very green. Everyone has to start somewhere. We've probably got a lot of inexperienced gamblers that watch these videos. So I'm going to use a fight like this as an opportunity to explain the best way to approach sports betting to give yourself the best chance of being profitable long term. And when it comes to a fight like this, it is the perfect type of fight where you can just let the odds do the work for you. Because if you take a look at the odds on this fight, we can see that Dan Ige is a pretty big underdog, right? Average odds of about 4.10, which is plus 310 for an implied probability of 24%. If we take a look at the odds on Movsar Evloev, he is around an average of 1.25, which is minus 400 for an implied probability of 80%. So you'll often hear me use the expression, you've just got to let the odds do the work for you. So what does that mean? Quite simply, all it means is when you put the odds into an implied probability calculator, it doesn't matter who you think will win, right? It doesn't matter who I think will win this fight this weekend. It doesn't matter if I think Evloev's going to win or Ige is going to win. The way you make money betting on sports is you look at the implied probabilities and you ask yourself, based on your research, does that fighter have a better chance of winning than that probability suggests? You just ask yourself, right, I've spent 2 hours researching this fight. Does Evloev have a better than 80% chance of winning? If your answer is no, you don't bet Evloev. It doesn't matter it doesn't matter if you think he'll win. If you cannot give him a better than 80% chance of winning, you don't bet him. It's as simple as that. And when it comes to a fighter like Dan Ige that is a big underdog, you just have to ask yourself the question, does he have a better than 24% chance of winning this fight? If your answer is no, move on, pass. You don't bet Dan Ige. But if your answer is yes, even if you think Evloev is more likely to win, you should seriously consider betting on Dan Ige. And that's the situation with this fight. Because after researching this matchup, I agree that Evloev should be the favourite here, and I think Evloev is more likely to win. I think this is a very tough stylistic matchup for Dan Ige, but you have to be absolutely out of your mind to not think that Ige's got a better than 24% chance of winning this matchup. It is such a low probability that Ige is getting absolutely no respect in this matchup, and I don't feel the odds reflect how competitive this fight could be. On the flip side, there are certain things that Evloev does well which can cause Dan Ige big problems. So this is one of those fights where it's absolutely possible that Evloev could come out, take Ige down and absolutely dominate him. I completely understand that. It can definitely happen. But there are also a lot of things that Ige does well which could cause Evloev big trouble. And in order for a fighter to command odds in this 1.25 minus 400 odds range, they have to have pretty much no way to lose. When you take into consideration all the crazy shit that can happen in MMA, like points deductions, disqualifications, fighters fighting injured, getting injured in fights. We saw Alexander Rakic a few weeks ago absolutely cruising against Blachowicz before blowing his knee out. Bad weight cuts, performance anxiety. There are so many things that can contribute to a fighter losing outside of how they match up from a stylistic point of view, that it is extremely difficult to give any fighter a better than 80% chance of winning. So straight away, when you see fights in this odds range, you want to be looking at the underdog and seeing if they've got any advantages here. And the underdog doesn't have to have many advantages in a fight like this to find value on them. Whenever I'm researching a fight, you've always want to have a visualization in your mind as a scale of risk to determine whether a bet is giving you a good risk to reward ratio or not. So what you want to do is set a baseline in that even money odds range, which is 2.0 plus 100. That's right in the middle of the risk to reward scale. And you know, anything one side of the scale moving into favourite odds territory from 2.0 down to like 1.01, which is like, you know, plus 100 down to, I don't even know what that would be, minus 10,000 maybe? Yeah, minus 10,000. In that range, the further away from plus 100 you get in odds, the less risk you can take on. So if you've got a fighter in that 1.80 minus 125 odds range, you could take on a decent amount of risk. You're getting roughly a 1-to-1 risk to reward ratio for whatever amount of money you put up. You get back $100, you know, you bet, you get roughly $100 back. You can take on a decent amount of risk in that risk to reward range. But as soon as you go to the other end of the scale and you start betting guys in that 1.20 minus 500, 1.25 minus 400 odds range, with these kind of implied probabilities, you can't have any significant risk factors. In order to find value there, your fighter has to have pretty much no way to lose. And so, depending on the odds will determine how much risk you can take on. Because every single bet has risk factors. Show me a fighter which doesn't have risk factors, and I'll show you a fight that you haven't researched properly. You will never find a bet without risk factors. And then the opposite side of that scale, you know, above 2.0 plus 100, as you go into 2.50 plus 150, 3.0 plus 200, the further away you get from that even money odds range, the more risk you can take on and still get yourself a good risk to reward ratio. Because you know, even if you were just hitting a win rate of, you know, 35, 40% on bets in this odds range that we find Dan Ige in, long term you're going to make a profit. And so as long as you're getting value, you know, as long as you're getting a margin of value over the bookies, these kind of bets can be gold long term. You'll probably lose a lot more of them than you'll win, but because the risk to reward or the payout in the odds is so generous, you don't need to win many of them to bank a long-term profit. So in MMA, a sport as chaotic as MMA, where you get flash knockouts and injuries and fighters that underperform and disqualifications and point deductions, you can capitalize on that variance and capitalize on that chaos by taking big underdogs like Dan Ige that have ways to win. And I'm not saying that Dan Ige should be favoured here. I'm not saying that Dan Ige's got a particularly good chance of winning. There are things Evloev does well that can cause Ige big trouble. But Ige has enough paths to victory which give you value in betting him with his implied probability being at just 24%. So I do want to make it very clear before I go into breaking this fight down, I think Evloev will win this weekend. I think Evloev wins more often than not. I think this is a very tough stylistic match for Dan Ige and he will probably lose. Despite that, we're not focusing on who's more likely to win or lose. We're focusing on which fighter gives us the best risk to reward ratio and if there's any value in betting on either guy. Evloev, there's zero value. Ige, there's quite a bit of value because he for sure has a better than 24% chance of winning this. So if you decide to tail this bet this weekend, please do your own research. Like I say, Ige will probably lose, but that doesn't change the fact that he's a very good value bet for the reasons that I'll explain now. So if we look at the tail of the tape, both guys are roughly about the same age and size. Ige is 30 years old, 5'7" with a 71-inch reach, and Evloev is 28 years old, 5'7" with a 72.5-inch reach. So nothing too notable there. However, when you look at both guys, Ige looks like a featherweight when he fights, and Evloev doesn't. When you look at Evloev, there's a real flatness and a sluggishness to everything that he does. He just doesn't really have that physicality at featherweight. He's quite small for a featherweight, and I really feel that this guy should be fighting in the bantamweight division. He's just not very physically imposing. He's got away with it up until this point in his career, but that's mainly because he hasn't fought a particularly good level of opponent. I think as Evloev starts to face a step up in competition, I think this guy is really going to struggle when he starts to face those bigger, stronger, more powerful, more athletic featherweights. And while from a wingspan point of view in terms of his height and reach, Dan Ige is also pretty small for a featherweight. Difference with Ige is that he has a real physicality to everything he does. He's got abnormal power for the division, you know, true legit one-shot KO power in his hands, and that kind of power that Ige brings to the table, that physicality, that respect that he demands in the octagon because of how much power he's got, is a great equalizer, and it kind of negates the fact that he's smaller than most of the guys he faces in the featherweight division. So what's really interesting about this matchup is that Evloev and Ige as featherweights are used to fighting guys that are bigger than them because they're small featherweights, but because they're both pretty small, we've got an interesting situation here where you've got two small featherweights going up against one another, and I really think that Ige's power and physicality could cause Evloev some problems in this matchup. Now, when we've got big underdogs, ultimately what we're looking for is paths to victory, right? Does this big underdog have any legitimate paths to victory? And what's very interesting about this matchup is Ige has a clear, obvious and huge path to victory over Evloev, which you very, very rarely find in big underdogs, because usually if a guy is a big underdog, they're second best to their opponent everywhere. Their opponent has an advantage over them in most areas. With Ige, that isn't the case, because if this fight stays standing, Ige is going to absolutely dominate. His advantages over Evloev on the feet are absolutely huge. Evloev's striking is super average. He doesn't move particularly well. He's very flat-footed. He's very bad defensively. He's got no power in his hands. Then Evloev also slows down a lot as fights wear on. And as fights wear on, he becomes sloppier and easier to hit. This is obviously a huge issue against someone like Dan Ige, who possesses big knockout power in his hands. Ige's got legit one-shot KO power in both his left and his right hand, and he only needs a tiny opening, one split-second mistake that Evloev may make to land a kill shot. Now, I know Evloev's undefeated, he's never been knocked out, but I also don't think he's fought any guys who are as dangerous on the feet as Dan Ige. We've seen Dan Ige rock, drop, wobble, knock out so many guys in his time in the UFC, and Evloev's striking defense is extremely bad. He will pose no threat to Ige on the feet. We also know Ige has got really nasty leg kicks that he can use to affect the mobility of Evloev and inflict major damage, and so it's very rare that a big underdog has a big advantage over their opponent everywhere, but I promise you, if this fight stays standing, Ige should cruise to a win. The problem, and the reason why Ige is a big underdog in this fight, is that his takedown defense is pretty bad, and he's very, very weak off his back, which is a huge issue against someone like Evloev, because Evloev is a good offensive wrestler. Evloev is the kind of guy that spams a lot of takedowns, hustles hard on the ground, and is really busy with his grappling control. And so, with how bad Ige's takedown defense has looked in the past, particularly his fight against Korean Zombie, with how weak Ige's looked off his back, Evloev should be able to get this fight to the ground and control Ige for long periods of time. Ige's big problem is that he has a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So when Ige gets taken down, quite often, instead of showing urgency to work his way back up to his feet, he spends too long on his back fishing for long shot submission attempts and doesn't actively try to work his way back up to his feet. He can, when he tries to scramble back up to his feet, he's pretty good at doing so, but this guy just spends way too long on his back, exactly like Polyana Viana last week. I hate fighters that don't show urgency in working their way back up to their feet, because the majority of the time in MMA, if you're on your back, you're in a losing position, right? Ige is a nightmare for it. He spends way too long on his back, which means this is a bad stylistic matchup for him, because we know Evloev is going to work really hard to get this fight to the ground and keep this fight on the ground. But there are some interesting things to talk about in terms of how both these two guys match up when it comes to grappling. The first is that Evloev doesn't have the best grappling control. So he's got good chain wrestling, he's very, very persistent with his grappling, but because he's quite undersized and lacks that physicality, he doesn't have that crushing strength and crushing physicality, that crushing grappling control that you see from guys like a Khabib or a Makhachev. For that reason, it's a lot easier to create scrambles against guys like Evloev and work your way back up to your feet against guys like Evloev, because they just don't have the physicality to hold you down. So, in terms of how these two guys match up when it comes to grappling, Ige's got a choice to make. Because Ige possesses the skills to work his way back up to his feet if he gets taken down. It's just a question of whether he will or not. He's got to make a conscious decision. Am I going to allow this guy to have a lot of top control on me, and I'm going to just try and catch him in submissions off my back? Or am I going to try and work my way back to my feet as quickly as I can and keep this fight standing where I have a huge advantage? Every weekend we see fighters demonstrate really bad fight IQ, and they don't take the easiest path to victory. But Ige's back is really against the wall in this matchup. He's coming into this fight on the back of a 2-fight losing streak. He's lost 3 of his last 4. And we know that fighters that lose 3 fights in a row often get released from the promotion. So Ige, he's still young in his MMA career. He's only had 20 pro fights. He's only 30 years old. If he wants to be a UFC fighter, he really, really needs to win this fight. And so Ige's chances of winning this fight are down to him, because he absolutely has the skills, the technical ability to work his way back up to his feet if he gets taken down. He needs to make the decision whether he's going to accept being on the bottom for long periods of time like he did against Korean Zombie, or if he's going to actively try to work his way back up to his feet. And if he does, I think Evloev's likely to be in a lot of trouble here, because Evloev is a guy that slows down a lot as fights wear on, and the harder you make this guy work for position on the ground, the more energy he's going to burn through. If you just give up cheap takedowns against Evloev and just lie on your back and do nothing and allow him to hold you down, Evloev's not going to slow down that much because he's not going to exert that much energy. But if you force him to work really hard for takedowns and you initiate a lot of scrambles on the ground, he's going to burn himself out pretty fast and look really sluggish and sloppy in the second half of the fight. Dan Ige has got to be coming into this matchup knowing that if he loses 3 fights in a row, he's probably going to be released from the promotion. And so you'd think this is the one time that he's going to show up and perform well and fight smart. And the problem that Evloev has got is that he's a very easy fighter to game plan for. He's a very meat and potatoes grappler. There's nothing special or flashy or particularly scary about his grappling. He's very average. I know he's got a great record, but MMA records don't tell the whole story. Doesn't have the best grappling control. He's just an average grappler. We saw a guy like Nick Lentz, for Christ's sake, give him all he could handle on the ground. He barely scraped past Lentz in a split decision. Dan Ige can definitely make life difficult for Evloev on the ground, but it comes down to his decision making, whether he accepts being on the bottom or not. But if you're Dan Ige, you've got to have signed the contract to take this fight, right? You know if you go 0-3, you're likely going to lose your job in the UFC, so why sign this contract unless you felt pretty confident you're going to win? If you just watched 30 minutes of footage on Evloev, you know exactly what to expect. You know exactly what to game plan for. Evloev, if you're a reasonably good level of grappler, is not a difficult fighter to neutralise. And so even though Dan Ige has given up cheap takedowns and spent way too long on his back hunting for long shot submissions in the past against other opponents, those other opponents, like Korean Zombie, a lot of the time had the element of surprise on their hands, and they were a lot more well-rounded than Evloev, and they could kind of use their striking to set up their grappling. Evloev doesn't have that. If Ige comes into this fight well prepared with a game plan and strategy to use his grappling in reverse to make Evloev work hard for takedowns and actively look to create scrambles to pop back up to his feet when he does get taken down, I think he can give Evloev absolute hell in this matchup. And like I say, the harder you make Evloev work on the ground, the sloppier, more tired, the worse defensively, the easier he becomes to hit in the second half of the fight. So if Ige makes Evloev work really hard on the ground early, it's going to pay off big time in the second and third round, when Evloev will be far more susceptible to Ige's big power shots that could potentially knock him out. The one thing about Ige is that we know he carries big power deep into fights. We've seen him rock and hurt guys very, very late into fights. And so in the third round, we know Evloev is going to be tired and sloppy. Ige is still going to be relatively fresh and relatively dangerous. So, to wrap all this up, for me, Dan Ige is an absolute no-brainer bet this weekend. I think he'll lose. Fighters are unfortunately creatures of habit. Human beings are creatures of habit. And all we can really do is try and indicate future performances by the things that fighters have shown us in the past. And ultimately, Ige does give up cheap takedowns and spend way too long on his back. If he does that against Evloev, he's probably going to lose because Evloev's just going to take him down and control him on the ground. However, there are enough ways in this matchup that Ige can win to give us value on him at big underdog odds. If this fight was in the even money odds range, if Ige was only a slight underdog, I'd probably pass on this one. Because like I say, it is very likely Evloev wins. But the fact that Ige is such a big underdog gives us such a good risk to reward ratio for our money. And there's so much value on Ige. You've got to be out of your mind to not see value in Ige. Even if you're Evloev's brother, coach, training partner, mum, you've got to be honest with yourself and give Ige a better than 24% chance of winning. And if you can do that, you've got to bet Ige because there's value on him. So, hope you found that breakdown video useful. Like I say, Ige will very likely lose, okay? But he's a good bet. And I hope you found that useful. So, let's now break down the main event between Alexander Volkov and Jairzinho Rozenstruik, which is a bit of a sucky main event. We've had some sucky main events lately. This is a bit of a sucky one. We're going to break it down from a betting point of view, and I really, really hope you find this one useful. So, if we take a look at the odds on this one, we can see Alexander Volkov is the favourite at average odds of about 1.65, which is minus 154 for an implied probability of 61%. If we take a look at the odds on Rozenstruik, he's around an average of 2.35, which is plus 135 for an implied probability of 43%. So it's another one of those fights in that kind of 60-40 odds range, with Volkov being favoured. And Volkov is 33 years old, 6'7", with an 80-inch reach. And Jairzinho Rozenstruik is 34 years old, 6'2", with a 78-inch reach. Let's talk a little bit about some X factors on this one. Because for the heavyweight division, 33 years old, 34 years old respectively for Volkov and Rozenstruik, they're pretty young heavyweights. Usually, under normal circumstances, I'd be saying that Volkov is a baby for a heavyweight, and at 33 years old, will likely be making big improvements from fight to fight. But the age, it doesn't tell the whole story, right? You've heard the saying, age is just a number. That does apply to MMA. With MMA, it's not so much the age of a fighter, it's the wear and tear on the body over the years, the injuries they've suffered, and how much trauma and damage that their body has sustained throughout their careers. And even though Volkov at just 33 years old is very, very young for a heavyweight, he's had 44 pro fights, which means the mileage on Volkov's body is way higher than your average, heavyweight in their early 30s. If you think about cars, right? If you've got a 3-year-old car which has got 200,000 miles on the clock, or a 10-year-old car which has got 2,000 miles on the clock, the 10-year-old car is probably going to be more reliable than the 3-year-old car because it hasn't been as much wear and tear on the engine and components, right? Exactly the same thing applies to MMA fighters. And with Volkov, not only has he had 44 pro fights, which is a lot for anyone, but Volkov was really thrown, right into the fire from very, very early on in his career. If we go back and look at his record, we can see that from day one, he was competing in M1 Global, which, back in, mid 2009, 2010, M1 was a very good promotion. It's fallen off quite a lot over the last few years. It used to be a much better promotion than it is now. So very, very early on in Volkov's career, he was facing a very high level of opponent. Guys like Denis Goltsov, Maxim Grishin, fought Rico Rodriguez pretty early in his career. And that's pretty major because what you see with a lot of guys is early in their career, they're only facing a low level of opponent, right? They're going out there, like Mozharov, smoking guys in 30, 40 seconds, racking up wins on their record, not really taking much damage. Volkov, like I say, was thrown into the fire from very early on in his career, and from day one has been competing against a really decent level of opponent. So the wear and tear on someone like Volkov's body is going to be far higher than, someone else with 44 pro fights that, maybe fought on the regional circuit in MMA for their first 20, 25 fights, something like that. Didn't take much damage. I remember watching Volkov in Bellator when he was in his early 20s, and this guy just used to get rocked, dropped, wobbled, knocked out all the time. He's long and skinny and quite slow and sluggish. I mean, his striking defense isn't very good now. It was way worse back when he fought in Bellator, and he used to take so much damage in his fights. He was involved in so many wars. Like, even when Volkov would win, his fights were always like crazy brawls. And so there's been an enormous amount of wear and tear and damage put on Volkov's body. And so at 33 years old, even though he isn't old for a heavyweight, we are starting to see significant decline in Volkov, where he just hasn't looked very good over the last few years, and he is getting worse and worse from fight to fight. This has also coincided with a move in training camps. So throughout the majority of Volkov's career, he lived and trained in Russia. And then in the last few years, he's moved his family to now live and train full time in California. And since doing that, he's kind of bulked up and become heavier. And as a result, he's become slower, sluggish. His gas tank isn't as good. And he's a lot worse defensively now. One of Volkov's biggest strengths throughout his career was that he didn't fight like a heavyweight. Sure, he was kind of big and slow and clunky, but in a division where, you know, most guys gas out and get tired as fights wear on, or most guys have low volume because they're looking to load up on those big singular power strikes, Volkov was a guy who was absolutely huge at 6'7", but his gas tank was amazing. You know, he threw a really high volume of strikes, and he could fight at a very high pace without slowing down, which made him very unique. There aren't many heavyweights like that, or there weren't many heavyweights like that. Now we've got the next generation of heavyweight, like a Cyril Gane. But back then, Volkov was, you know, an absolute cardio machine, which was a very rare thing to see in the heavyweight division. And so that was his real edge, if you like. That was what made him great. That's what made him a formidable heavyweight. That's what made him a tough stylistic matchup for many guys, because very few guys could keep up with the pace that he set. You know, we saw him kind of weather the early storm and outwork Fabrizio Verdum late on. We saw him, you know, I know he lost to Curtis Blades. We saw him cause Curtis Blades problems late on as well. You know, Volkov was one of these guys that would kind of, you know, Homer Simpson you. It's kind of ironic that his nickname is Drago after Ivan Drago in Rocky, because Volkov has basically built a career off Rocky's strategy of taking a beating, weathering the early storm, and then dragging you into deep water in the later stages of the fight where he can drown you with his volume and toughness and work rate. The problem that Volkov's got at the moment is, since moving from Russia to California, he just can't fight at that same pace anymore. And now he's kind of just like any other heavyweight that's flat, you know, doesn't throw a particularly high volume of strikes, is quite slow and sluggish, and slows down a lot as fights wear on. And because there was nothing particularly spectacular about Volkov's skill set in terms of, you know, not a particularly great grappler, not a particularly great striker, now he has become a very average heavyweight since declining over the last few years. And so at this stage in his career, this amount of miles on the clock, I don't see Volkov getting any better. And yeah, it's one of those situations where, again, Father Time is undefeated and it's hitting Mr. Volkov pretty hard, which is a real big shame. So, when you look at Rozenstruik, what's interesting is he's a year older than Volkov, but he's got far less fights, right? He's got 30% of the number of fights that Volkov has had. And while I know Rozenstruik does have an extensive kickboxing career, he isn't showing any signs of decline or any sign of slowing down in the UFC. If anything, he's going to be getting better with him being so young in his MMA career. You know, his trajectory is going to be this, and Volkov's trajectory is this. So Volkov is, you know, longer and taller than Rozenstruik. Both guys have got roughly the same reach advantage, but I wouldn't expect size to have too much of an influence on this matchup, simply because Volkov doesn't do a particularly good job of using his length. He's quite slow, quite sluggish, fights with his hands down low, leaves his chin up high and exposed. And we know that Rozenstruik is an absolute sniper on the feet. He can cover distance very quickly, fast hand speed, and he can deliver true legit one-shot KO power in his punches. So I don't think Volkov's going to be able to use his length that well here, because when Rozenstruik comes forward and fully commits, he covers distance too quickly for Volkov to really use his length and react to it. So I don't see size as being too much of an issue here. Now, what's interesting about this fight is that both these guys are primarily strikers, right? You often see Volkov wearing the kickboxing ankle wraps. We know Rozenstruik is a pure striker. And whenever we break down a Rozenstruik fight, we've always got to talk about his limitations on the ground. Rozenstruik's takedown defense is a joke, and he has virtually no ground game. When you watch Rozenstruik on the ground, it's like this guy has never taken a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class. And while we know Volkov's ground game isn't great, Aspinall certainly showed that in his last fight, we do know that Volkov can grapple on the ground. And pretty much any amount of MMA grappling is enough to cause Rozenstruik big trouble. So if Volkov were to come into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, he should be able to take Rozenstruik down pretty easily and dominate him on the ground. Now I know Volkov is also low level on the ground, but there are different degrees of badness, right? And Volkov is a far better grappler than Rozenstruik is. So if Volkov comes into this fight with a grappling heavy game plan, this should be an easy fight for him, and that's one area where he's got a massive advantage over Rozenstruik. The problem is that Volkov is predominantly a kickboxer, and for whatever reason, due to fight IQ or bad strategy and game planning or stubbornness, maybe it's his ego, for whatever reason, Volkov doesn't like to grapple. He doesn't grapple very often, and so he rarely comes in with grappling heavy game plans. So even though that would be the easiest way for him to win this fight this weekend, I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to win a kickboxing match. Which makes this a pretty interesting fight, to be honest with you, because both these guys have very different styles of striking. Volkov is a volume striker, whereas Rozenstruik is that big single shot power striker who's looking to deliver that one kill shot and knock you out. But you know what Chael Sonnen says? Chael Sonnen's got a great quote that when you try and win a fight by knockout, you often end up losing by decision. And Rozenstruik is a great example of why that quote is so accurate. Because if you look at Rozenstruik's record, this guy doesn't win decisions. You look at it, all of his wins are basically by finish. He's had 15 pro fights. He's only ever won one decision as far as I can see. These are kickboxing matches, so they don't count. He's only ever won one decision, and that was by split decision, which indicates it was a pretty close fight. But as you can see, all of his fights have come by knockout inside the distance. And obviously he was 4 seconds away from losing another decision to Overeem. Overeem was up big time on the scorecards. What you can see is every time Rozenstruik does go to a decision, he loses a decision. And the reason being, he's just very inactive. He doesn't throw very much. He doesn't let his hands go. You get long periods of inactivity with Rozenstruik where he doesn't do a lot. Because he's not interested in chipping away at you, racking up points, racking up volume. Chipping away at the lead leg with leg kicks, pumping the jab. That's not Rozenstruik's game. He's just looking to knock you out. And so if he doesn't knock you out, chances are he's going to lose a decision, because it's very, very easy to outwork this guy. You don't have to do much to outpoint him, because he just doesn't let his hands go. He's so inactive. Now Volkov is the complete opposite, right? Even though Volkov's volume has dropped while he's been declining the last few years, he still throws a lot more volume than Rozenstruik. And so we know if this fight stays standing, so long as Volkov can avoid getting himself knocked out, he's very likely to win a decision, because Rozenstruik isn't going to be able to outpoint him. I mean, maybe Rozenstruik comes in and actually lets his hands go for once and throws with more volume. But again, all we can do is make the best decision possible with the information we've got available. And that that isn't reflected in Rozenstruik's past performances, right? Rozenstruik is usually a very low volume striker. So we know if it stays standing, Volkov is likely to outpoint him. So now we have to consider, from a betting point of view, how likely is it that Rozenstruik can knock Volkov out? And it's kind of difficult to answer that question, because it cannot be ignored that Rozenstruik is a devastating knockout artist that can cover distance very quickly and deliver fight-ending power with devastating speed and accuracy. And it also can't be ignored that Volkov has really bad striking defense. He's slow, he's sluggish, he doesn't move his head much, he fights with his hands down low. He is going to be a sitting duck to the knockout and a sitting duck to Rozenstruik's power punches. But there is a saying in football that if you don't shoot, you don't score. And if you don't throw many punches, your probability of knocking your opponent out is a lot less. And that's really Rozenstruik's problem. When he lands, it's devastating, but he just doesn't pull the trigger enough to really stack the odds in his favour of landing knockouts. So while Volkov will be in a lot of trouble if Rozenstruik lands clean and hard on him, the fact that Rozenstruik doesn't pull the trigger that much and is a very low volume striker makes it difficult to feel confident that Rozenstruik's going to be able to win this one by knockout. And while Volkov is on a steep decline and, isn't the best defensively, can't deny the fact that he's a tough fucking Russian. And tough Russians are not easy to finish. Volkov has got the heart of a lion, the spirit of a champion. He's the kind of guy that you have to kill in order to finish. If you look at his record, he's got 10 losses on his record. But very, very few guys have been able to knock him out. If we go back to the start of his UFC career when he made his debut against Tim Johnson, we can see that since then he's had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 fights in the UFC. So this will be Volkov's 13th fight in the UFC. And only one guy has been able to knock him out in those 12 fights, and that was Derrick Lewis, one of the most devastating knockout artists in the history of the UFC. No shame in losing by knockout to Derrick Lewis. No shame in getting knocked out by Derrick Lewis. And we can see that there was only 11 seconds to go in that fight. Volkov was actually winning that fight. He was a bit of a buzzer beater. He was 11 seconds away from winning a decision against Derrick Lewis. But we can see that throughout Volkov's last 12 fights and his entire career in the UFC, he's fought some big punches, man. Tim Johnson can crack. Ironically, reason why this fight did end in a split decision was because Volkov did get dropped and wobbled a couple times in this fight. He was in a lot of trouble. But he went the distance with Roy Nelson, who back in 2017 was a devastating knockout artist. Fabrizio Verdum can crack. Greg Hardy back in 2019 was a lot more dangerous than he is now. Walt Harris can crack. Overeem can crack. And these guys weren't able to put Volkov away on the feet. So he is bad defensively. He is on a decline, but he's still a tough Russian. You've got to respect his durability. So if we bring this full circle, summarize everything that we've talked about from a betting point of view, if you really want to bet this fight this weekend, I think Volkov gives you the better risk to reward ratio. He is on a steep decline. He is getting worse. He is bad defensively, and maybe Rozenstruik makes him pay for it. But ultimately, he has a huge advantage on the ground over Rozenstruik. And we know that if the fight stays standing, so long as Volkov can avoid getting himself knocked out, he probably will outwork and outstrike Rozenstruik to take down a decision win. So there aren't really many areas here where Rozenstruik has an advantage other than landing the kill shot. Rozenstruik doesn't really have much of a path to victory, and with how difficult it is to put Volkov away and how Rozenstruik doesn't really let his hands go that much, you've got to think a finish isn't super likely. Now from a betting point of view, it's not a fight I'm going to be betting on. I don't think there's much value either side, if I'm honest. I definitely wouldn't be betting Rozenstruik here. He doesn't appeal to me with how limited his paths to victory are in, only just a slightly better than even money odds range. But when it comes to Volkov, even though his odds are playable as a moderate favourite, there is still a lot of issues with him. And, I don't trust that he's going to be able to survive 25 minutes in there with Rozenstruik without getting dinged, considering, his age, his decline, and how easy he is to hit, and, of course, how dangerous Rozenstruik is. So I'm going to be passing on this one, but I hope you found that breakdown video useful. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you like these videos, and also hit the like button below. If this video gets 150 likes, we will do a bunch of live streams next week with some UFC 275 related content. And if you want to watch breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card, watch me analyse all the prelim matchups, which to be fair are probably more interesting than the main card fights this week, head on over to my website, MMABettingTips.com. I'm sure you'll love it. You can talk to me every day in the chat room as well as other people in my community, and you'll find a bunch of bets on there as well. Pretty much all of them are profitable. I think you'll like it, so check it out. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I will see you in the next one. UFC 275. Have a great weekend, guys. I hope you crush it.